Hi folks, today we're going to be talking about Edgar Allan Poe. Not the gothic, depressed figure of myth, but the real Edgar Allan Poe. Here on Lessons from the Purple Chair. Prophet, said I, thing of evil. Prophet still, if bird or devil. Whether tempest sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore. Desolate yet all undaunted, and this desert land enchanted. On his home by horror haunted, tell me, truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Hi, and welcome back to Lessons from the Purple Chair. One intellectual's musings from the comfort of a big purple wingback. I'm your host, Professor Timothy R. Crowe. And of course, that verse I just read to you comes from the famous poem, The Raven, by Edgar Allan Poe, considered by many to be one of the best, if not the best, writer and author to come out of American literature. And I personally feel that he is the greatest writer to come out of this country. However, Edgar Allan Poe, over the over 150 years since he's been gone, he's earned a rather unflattering reputation. True, he wrote a lot of macabre and dark literature, such as The Telltale Heart, Pit and the Pendulum, Mask of the Red Death, Fall of the House of Usher. A lot of really dark and even creepy literature. Still, it's kind of partially affected, his image over time. He's seen as this grim, pale, weak, whiny, chronically depressed, sitting in the darkness, little wimpy figure. That's just sitting and always crying, woe is me, and apathetic. Basically a 19th century version of an emo. And that's the image that everyone seems to have of Edgar Allan Poe. He's almost become this idolized figure of being gothic, of being a goth. In fact, I've even seen it said where, goth before there was goth. However, none of that is really true. Now, it is true that Edgar Allan Poe did go through some big bouts of depression, that he had a lot of tragedy and turmoil and sadness in his life. But this image of him as being this depressive, weak and pale, gothic figure sitting in the shadows, bemoaning the world, it's really not Edgar Allan Poe. And that's what I'm going to talk about here today, is about the real Edgar Allan Poe. Now, first, to get started, let's talk a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe's history. He was born in 1809 to his parents, David Poe Jr. and Eliza Poe, and both of which had been entertainers and actors. And it appears that David Poe abandoned his family, his wife and his 3 children, before Poe was 3 years old. And Eliza, who was a famous actress on the traveling circuit, did try to keep up her family as well as she could. However, she ended up contracting tuberculosis, and while in Richmond, Virginia, she grew very, very ill, and basically very destitute and poor. The community kind of kicked in to help out, to keep her up as best they could, but she ended up lying in a boarding house with her 3 children surrounding her, coughing up blood and dipping into delirium until she finally died. Edgar, it's doubted that he had any memory of his mother or anything really tangible, but it is known that he carried a miniature portrait of her with her his entire life. And it seems throughout his entire life he kept seeking a female figure to lean on, to take solace in. In fact, he kind of idolized women. He did enjoy the company of women more than he did men. And the tragedy of death among the women in his life will become a theme. Now, Edgar and the other children have been separated out, and adopted or by other families. And Edgar was taken in, not so much adopted, by the Allan family. John Allan and Frances Allan, who had no children. John Allan had been a fairly wealthy tobacco merchant, and he and his wife had no children. And when they took in Edgar, Frances doted on him quite a bit. Was a true mother figure to him. However, John never did really take to Edgar. I don't think he was ever treated him like a true son. Never legally adopted him. And even though Edgar took on the Allan name, John never seemed to match up with him. So, and also, Edgar ended up getting a crush on the mother of a friend of his, a woman named Jane Stannard, who ended up having a brain cancer, and she died when Edgar was about 15. And he was very, very close to this woman, and apparently this death really struck him hard. He'd go cry on her grave. Finally, Edgar was sent off to school. And even before that, now we think of Edgar Allan Poe as, I said, this weak, pale little figure sitting in the dark. However, that was not true at all. Even as a young teenager, Edgar Allan Poe was actually a bit of a jock. He was big into sports and exercise and physical activity. He loved to box. He loved to compete in track and running and swim. He actually once, when he was 15, swam 6 miles up the Jane River, on a dare, and actually become legendary for this. I mean, this was no weakling. He was a bit, like I said, he was a bit of a jock. He was a very strong and confident young man. So he got in 1827. He found out that his stepmother, Frances, had also contracted tuberculosis like his mother, which back then that was a death sentence, and he knew it. And he found out that his stepfather was having affairs while his stepmother was lying, dying, and sick. He was having affairs and bringing the women in the house. And I think there was a lot of conflict between him and the stepfather over this. And finally, John sent him away to the University of Virginia 2 years after it had been opened in 1827. However, he sent him with 1/3 of the money that he needed to go. To me, I think that he didn't like Edgar, and he was setting him up to fail. He wanted him to go fail so he'd have an excuse to disown him in front of his wife. That's my opinion. So, but Edgar got there, and Edgar was very much contrary to that sad, depressive figure that we all come to know. He actually was a bit of a frat boy type. He was a party animal. He loved to drink. He loved to hang out with his buddies in the bars and the taverns. He loved to dance. He loved to laugh. He was very, he used to sit and write stories and read them to people in his dorms. He would paint murals on his walls. This was not a depressive figure, a depressed young man. However, he did have to struggle in school because he did not have the money to get by. In fact, at one point, he ended up having to burn the furniture in his room to stay warm. And even though he kept pleading with his stepfather, "Hey, you've sent me here. Can you at least pay for my education?" Nothing ever come through. He actually tried to gamble and make money. That didn't work. He ended up in debt, and he ended up having to leave school, which gave the stepfather the excuse to say, "Look, he's a loser." But Edgar went on from there. He got into the army. He actually did quite well in the military while he was there. But he wanted to move on, and maybe out of some sort of guilt, his stepfather did pay for him to get out of the army so he could go to West Point. However, he did not like West Point, and that type of military was not for Edgar. He was far too creative and for all of this. So he just stopped stop showing up on call. So he ended up getting kicked out, which is exactly what he wanted. But when that happened, suddenly the stepfather's like, that's it. I don't want anything else to do with him. And even more than that, in 1829, Frances, his stepmother, finally succumbed to tuberculosis after a long bout with the sickness. And that really, this is 3 women in his life that have all died, and 2 of which have died from tuberculosis. And other than that, he's also being rejected by his stepfather. Now he's destitute. He has nothing. He ended up finally wandering to his family in Massachusetts. That didn't work out well. They robbed him. And he finally ended up in Baltimore, Maryland, with his maternal aunt, Maria Clem, who took him in, and there he really found some family support. He was living there with his aunt and his cousin Virginia, who was a very young little girl at the time. And not during this, within a few years, he actually did end up getting a job with the Southern Literary Messenger as an editor in 1835 in Richmond, Virginia. So he left his newfound family with his aunt and his cousin, and he went there. And actually, it's here that he really showed his brilliance as both an editor and a writer. He wrote many of his great stories, a lot of his stories during this time period, and would have them published. However, he made no money at it. Back then, there wasn't very good publishing laws, and writers were taken advantage of. Their stories were bought for pennies. Often they weren't even paid or paid on time as they were promised. There were no residuals for reprints. So, you really couldn't make much of a living off of writing at the time. But as an editor, he did get a salary, and he turned out to be a brilliant critic, and master of knowing literature and how literature functions. However, he also showed another part of his true personality. Rather than being this depressive, woe is me, weak little figure, actually Edgar Allan Poe, excuse me, was actually very egotistical, was very pedantic, was a bit pretentious, very pretentious, and and in his criticism of literature, he made a lot of enemies. He would, one of his jobs was that he would look at new come out books or short stories or poems, and he would critique them publicly. He was a public critic, and he got to be known as the Tomahawk Man because he would just slice them apart. He got in a lot of arguments and a lot of made a lot of enemies by doing this. And he especially did not like Longfellow. He despised Longfellow. He thought he was a hack. In fact, he even accused him publicly of plagiarism. And that made Longfellow was the most popular author in America at the time, and that did not win him any friends. I can tell you that. But if you read his reviews and his knowledge, you realize he was a very brilliant, a very literary. He is and intellectually he was a very brilliant young man. Now his life kind of turned around a bit when he found out that his 12-year-old cousin was going to be moving away from Baltimore to move with other relatives, and there was even a hint that there may be a possible marriage in the works. He went into a huge drinking binge, and every now and then he would go on these drinking binges. Edgar Allan Poe did have problems with alcohol. He wasn't like typical alcoholics, though. I mean, he would go long bouts that he wouldn't drink at all, and then he'd go on a binge, which to me says he may have some mental health issues. May have been dealing with some sort of bipolarism or something like that. But either way, he went on this drunken binge, almost lost his job, and he wrote this long letter begging his aunt and his cousin not to do this. That he couldn't live without her, and he was in love with his 12-year-old cousin. Yeah. So, by this time, Edgar Allan Poe was, in his late 20s. He's like 26. She was 12. And he begged, I love her. Please don't do this. Don't move away. You are my sister. You're my little wife. All of this, and he actually did end up going and marrying his 12, almost 13-year-old cousin. In fact, they listed on there that she was 21 on the license to avoid scandal. Yeah. But apparently, despite how kind of gross that is today, they seem to have had a very good marriage, a very loving marriage. He was crazy about her. He was good to her. And they were very happy together. Edgar Allan Poe, they used to get out in the yard and play games. And they had pets. And he taught her how to play the flute. And, they would play one time they were playing leapfrog in the yard. And Edgar Allan Poe jumped too high and ripped his pants. And he was embarrassed. She thought this was the funniest thing in the world. And they had this huge, they were constantly laughing. So this is not your depressive gentleman. However, this type of, and he did, and here's another thing you never hear about Edgar Allan Poe. He was a workaholic. He may have been an alcoholic, but he was also a workaholic. This guy never stopped working. He would work 16 hours a day, often running several publishing houses, were hired to be the editor and the publisher. And back then, that job included him, not only getting all the stories and getting all the subscriptions and putting the magazine together, and doing the editing and proofreading for all of the material coming in. And he also contributed. He would commonly work for these publishing houses that he was editor of, and the pay was horrible, all day. And then half the night he'd sit and write his own stories. And a lot of his famous stories that he wrote were written in this time period. The man was truly a workaholic, and he was throughout all of his life. However, he made very little money, and he was constantly around the edge of he was always in poverty and around the edge of being indigent and homeless. For a long time he only had one coat. And the thing is, Edgar Allan Poe, even then, what was he like? Was he a whiny little guy? No. True, he was highly dramatic. I think he was a bit overbearing. I don't think I would have liked his company very much. I think he'd have been annoying, with that ego and that pretension. But he was raised in Richmond, Virginia, in the best schools, and he was raised to be a Virginian gentleman, a Southern gentleman, with all of the manners and decorums of a Southern gentleman. So, with his speaking voice, with his manners, all of that was that of a Virginian Southern gentleman, even if he didn't have any money. He was very broke. He would commonly write letters to people, say, "I'd love to come to a ball, but I do not have a shirt. All of this, I'm so destitute," trying to get money from people. He commonly had to borrow money. He was constantly in debt. And all of that would cause him to go into bouts of depression, which to me is very normal. I mean, the guy's half broke. He's broke. He's got a family. He's trying to support them, and he's running on poverty. He's working himself to death. That type of pressure would cause some depression. Also, he would go on binges of drinking, and I think that also was brought on by the stress and the worry and the depression. It's hard to constantly be working 16 hours a day, running all of these jobs, and you're still barely able to keep firewood and food in your wife's mouth. That is very difficult. So. I think I do think he had an alcohol problem. Is obviously had an alcohol problem, but as far as his depression, it seems more environmental than to be something physical, something mental. So, that's one thing. However, his tribulations weren't over in his tragedy, especially when it came to women. One day when she was singing a song, he noticed that she had a little cough, and his wife. And he noticed there was some blood on her lips, and he knew what that meant. She had contracted tuberculosis, which there was no cure. And, and he knew this. And this set off, she was a very young woman, only about 19 at that time. And she had a 5-year-long battle with it. And during that 5 years, it was pure hell on Edgar Allan Poe. And actually, a lot of his more macabre stories, like the fall of the House of Usher, and a lot of these, these other stories were written during this time period. Also, the Mask of the Red Death, which that's very obviously being influenced by him having to deal with tuberculosis, which is because you bleed out your mouth, you cough up blood. Everybody dying when it comes around. I mean, that the metaphor is very clear there with his life. And that so even in his tragedy, it drove on his brilliance, and he it was almost therapeutically took this out in the written word. Well, finally, and he was once again fighting for to make the ends meet. He finally had his wife finally succumbed to tuberculosis. In 1847, which nearly destroyed him. Here he did describe, and a lot of times you see these quotes about, he gives about going mad and just hating life. And this was during that time period, that year or so before he died, when his wife had passed away, when he watched her lay and suffer for 5 years. And also in poverty with her and watching her die. That would make anybody depressed. That'd make anybody half insane. But, Edgar Allan Poe did pull himself out of it, as he always did. That's one thing that's reoccurring. He was not this person that is slayed, oh, woe is me, I want to die. Yes, he went through the melodrama of his depression, the melodrama of his tragedy, and he would get deep into alcoholism and depression and wallow in it. But can you blame the guy? 5 years watching your wife die, your mother died, your stepmother died. That's a lot of tragedy. But each time that happened, even with his wife, he didn't stay in that position. He mourned it out. He stood himself up. And he kept driving himself on, even with all the adversity against him, with him not making any money. He never gave up his drive to have his own magazine, to make his money through the thing he loved, which was being an author, an editor, and being in literature. He never stopped. He was a workaholic, and he never gave up. Edgar Allan Poe never laid down on his laurels. He might have knocked him down. He had some screaming, crying, drunken bouts to get through the environmental depression, but he never laid down and stopped. He wanted to, but he never did. He kept driving himself on, and that's the type of man that Edgar Allan Poe was. Not someone that just laid in the corner and said, "Oh, woe is me, let the world all go by me," and meant it and just no. He kept pushing, which takes a lot of strength. And you never hear that about Edgar Allan Poe. Well, finally, Edgar Allan Poe, right after he picked himself up after his wife had died, and he got over the major grief from that, things actually started to turn around a little bit for him. This guy had no luck, though. There had been a lady that he had been engaged to when he was a younger man, and while he was away at school, she had she'd gotten married to somebody else, and she actually had quite a bit of money, and so he finally, she'd finally become a widow at this point, and he started talking to her. Her name was Emma Shelton, and he started talking to her, and they ended up getting engaged. Now, she was a woman of some means, so he was actually marrying into some money. Finally, there would be a great financial support. He'd also raised funds to start his own magazine, to start his own journal and publication. And he was very excited about that. So he was about to get a rich wife and get his own magazine. Things were going great. And then he went on a business trip to collect subscriptions and set up subscriptions and all of this. And something went horribly wrong, which we will never know exactly what it was. Edgar Allan Poe, he left. He actually visited some friends on this business trip. And they had noticed he's well dressed. He always was well dressed, as well dressed as he could be. He visited some friends, and they all noted that he wasn't drunk. He had actually given up drinking, joined the temperance movement, and but he gave up. He had visited. They did notice that he looked pale and not well. And then finally, for a few days, he just kind of disappeared. And then he was actually found on October 3rd in Baltimore, Maryland, passed out basically in the gutter near a bar. And to this day, we don't know what happened to him. He was passed out in this gutter, and it's very strange because Edgar Allan Poe was a very dapper dresser. But he was found wearing clothes and shoes that weren't his. He's wearing like an old bib overhaul types of things, shirt that didn't fit him, and he was wearing like an old straw hat and a pair of shoes too big for him with no stockings, but he was completely unresponsive. He was, and they've actually called some friends of his in Baltimore, and they ended up getting him into the local hospital. He never completely regained consciousness. When he did, he was delirious. They said he just sat and spoke to phantoms on the wall. And finally, after 5 days of this, he ended up. He was running high fevers. All of this, delirious. He finally died on October 7th, 1849, at the age of 40. So what happened to him, we really don't know. There's been a lot of speculation. What disease did he have? What happened to him? How did he end up in these clothes? Where had he been? Well, one theory is that he may have been kidnapped. It did happen to be the night before had been the night of the election in town, and there was this thing called cooping. And what they would do is these gangs of men were being hired by the politicians that were running to go out, and basically they would find some derelict, find some person, and they would get them drunk and drug their drinks, and then they would take them around to different polling stations to keep voting. And they'd also then change their clothes and take them around again under different names. And they keep just feeding them just tons of alcohol and drugs and keep them going around and doing this. That would answer why he was wearing, like country bumpkin clothes, which Edgar Allan Poe would never have worn. And there are, and once they were done with him, they just dumped him. Now this could have led to alcohol toxification. That is possible. And there are also some indications that Edgar Allan Poe had a problem with alcohol. It said that he could drink one glass of wine and be completely drunk and passing out and sick. And even his doctor said that he thought he had an issue with alcohol. So there are a lot of conditions by which, people have an allergy to alcohol. And it sounds like that may have been the case with him, why it took so little to get him drunk. And if that is the case, and they were just slamming alcohol down him for like an entire day or so, then that could do it. That could have caused a toxicity in his bloodstream. It could have, which definitely would have affected his mind, would have left him in delirium, and that could have killed him. Some people have suggested other things. There have been suggestions maybe he had a brain tumor, and that may have caused death. That would answer a lot. They've also been speculating maybe he got rabies. That would does kind of fit the symptoms of rabies, or syphilis. Personally, from looking at the evidence, I mean that doesn't those symptoms, those diseases don't answer. Well, why is he? Where's his clothes, and why is he dressed like this? And and what happened to him? Well, how do you end up in a gutter? Rabies doesn't answer all that. Syphilis doesn't answer all that. I think what happened was the cooping did happen to him. I think maybe he fell off the wagon, hit the bar, maybe to celebrate or something. Maybe he wasn't feeling well at the time, and he ends up getting a little drunk. Some people see him. Some of these ruffians take him in and get him drunk and stoned and all this, and take him around, and they just keep feeding him alcohol. Maybe he did have a brain tumor, and that it could be a combination of them all. He could have had an allergy to alcohol, and also a brain tumor, which that would have affected, that much alcohol would have affected the brain tumor, and he could have, and that could have killed him. But either way, it was a very strange and tragic death for what became America's most esteemed and best author. Because there was a fire in the records department, so we don't have the death certificate. There was no autopsy performed, and they actually buried him with very little fanfare in an unmarked grave. Later on, about 26 years later, they dug him back up and actually dropped his remains and scattered his remains, had to gather those back up. He couldn't catch a break, and they reburied him in a more prestigious monument, because he became very famous after his death from his writings and the republication of his collected works. But it was a sad end to Edgar Allan Poe. But to me, what is even more sad is the character assassination that came afterwards. There had been a man named Rufus Griswold, and he knew Edgar Allan Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe in 1842 had wrote a scathing review and criticism of some of his literature, just really trashed him. And Rufus never forgot this. And somehow Rufus managed to become executor for his estate at the time, and he wrote this very long obituary in one of the New York papers. And in this obituary, he described Edgar Allan Poe as a drunkard, as being half insane, chronically depressed, a layabout, shiftless and lazy, just laid around drunk and depressed, and woe is me. Basically, he created this entire image that we still have of Edgar Allan Poe as this depressive, half crazy, lazy, drunkard goth that just sits around in the dark and whines and melodrama and depression and negativity. So this really was created by Griswold. Now, several people, when they read that, who knew Edgar Allan Poe, was like, "That's not Poe," and they tried to they rebutted this. They put out their own articles, but it was already done. That was widely read, and that this type of biography of him was what was accepted, and from then on, Edgar Allan Poe was emo boy, and that's not Edgar Allan Poe at all. And to me, that's even more tragic than what happened to him on October 3rd when he was found in the gutters. And that can only happen once. He can only die once. There's been this character assassination of his has been going on since 1849. And that's a shame. Because Edgar Allan Poe, when you really sum up what he was a man who persevered through a lot of tragedy, through a lot of tribulations, never stopped fighting through poverty and hardship. He was a workaholic. He was a brilliant. He had a brilliant mind. He was a very talented and brilliant writer. He was a Southern gentleman. And a man who liked to laugh, liked to party, who was good to his friends, who was good to his family. And he never stopped pushing and trying, and he was a man of great ambition, and great determination. And that's the Edgar Allan Poe that people should remember. Well, folks, that's all I've got for Edgar Allan Poe. I hope that you maybe learned some things and actually learned if you didn't already know, who Edgar Allan Poe really was. Not this depressed man sitting in the shadows, but a man that never stopped pushing forward, a very ambitious and talented man that kept pushing forward. And hey, if you're liking this channel, please take a few minutes to hit this purple chair and give me a like and subscribe. We've got a lot more stuff coming up on this channel. So until I speak to you next time, find yourself a comfy chair, find yourself a good book, and find your passion. Later.